It is Lent. We have 40 days in which to prepare ourselves for Easter. A practice within Christian churches has been that during that time of preparation that people sometimes will give something up because, as we'll see in our third scripture passage, and how we heard too from what the passages that Lois read, that there's this understanding that we as human beings are tempted by certain things, and in preparation for Easter, we try to deal with those temptations. We try to be more disciplined and not give in to them. So we can do some things that are just incredibly difficult. You know, we give up chocolate for the next 40 days, or desserts, or soda, or beer. You know, any spiritual discipline is helpful. But I think we have to be careful when that's how we start to think about Lent, because that really minimizes what's happening. At least it minimizes what's happening based on what Jesus does out in the wilderness. And what Jesus does out in the wilderness is incredibly significant, but perhaps because we're afraid of what it's calling us to do, we do tend to minimize it a little bit. We tend to think, okay, if I give up some of these temptations, then I'm sort of following in Jesus' footsteps. I think it's more than that. Let's keep an open mind and heart as we hear, and let us listen for the word of God as it's found in the Gospel according to Matthew, reading from the 4th chapter, verses 1 through 11. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Jesus fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, God will command God's angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to him, "All these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only God." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. May God bless this reading from Holy Scripture. The context of this passage is important to bear in mind. Jesus has lived his life up to this point about 30 years. We're not sure what he did, how he lived it exactly. Based on this story, we can gather that he must have studied Scripture, understood Scripture pretty well, but we're not sure what else he did. But we do know he decided to get baptized, and after his baptism, we're told that the Spirit of God kind of whispers in his ear, or whisks him up, or however the Spirit worked with Jesus at that moment in time, and said, "All right, time for you to head off into the wilderness, into the desert, and you're going to be there for 40 days. You're going to fast." Now we might, and I think appropriately so, ask the question, what's the point? Why is Jesus out there? What's he trying to do for 40 days? If he's the Son of God, he's perfect, he has all this power, what's Jesus out there? What's he trying to accomplish? And that's open to all sorts of interpretations. I had a little aha yesterday, and I think what Jesus is out there trying to do is trying to figure out how he's going to become his authentic self. His authentic Jesus self. Because remember, there were all these expectations of the Son of God, of the Messiah, right? And people hold those expectations. We hear them being kind of thrown at Jesus throughout his ministry. Well, the Messiah is going to come in power and overthrow the Roman government or whoever happened to be in power at that time and reestablish the nation of Israel in a strong and powerful way. These were the expectations. And if Jesus has any sense that he's truly the Son of God, then he must recognize that this is the expectation of him. This is what people think he's got to do, who he's going to be. So he goes out there for 40 days and he prays and he meditates, he speaks and he listens, and then he comes out of that time and he's met by the tempter, this personification of evil that we've called the devil, Satan. And the tempter tries to tempt him to use the powers that are expected that he will use. These miraculous powers to turn rocks into bread, the power of his connection with God to throw himself off the top of the temple and be saved, or the power to control all these people and all these places if only Jesus will worship him. And Jesus responds that he's not going to do that. But you know what else Jesus responds? He doesn't act like the Messiah was supposed to act. Somehow, some way, over the course of that time that he's out in the wilderness, over those 40 days, he comes to recognize that his authentic self, that who God is calling him to be, who God made him to be, is not the Messiah that overthrows and overrules everybody, but rather someone who demonstrates God's love with any and all people, with the outcast, who goes, one of his first acts after he comes out of the wilderness is to go off into Capernaum. He's not in the seat of power at all. He's off in this sort of border town with not only Jews, but people of other faiths and no faith at all. He calls his disciples, but they're not educated, powerful people. They're fishermen, some of them very poor, some of them middle class. He does all these things that are not expected of the Messiah. Something happened to Jesus out there. He was able to find his authentic self. This is who God called him to be, and this is how God called him to be in the world. And he heard it because he was willing to get away from all the distractions, to move away from his family, to move away from his friends, to move away from all the noise, all the obligations, all that kind of stuff. He was willing to do that. And in the process of talking and listening carefully, this is what he found. And he had to know what a risk this was. He had to know what a chance he was taking. And yet he chose to do it anyway because he knew that if he was going to live authentically, if he was going to live into who he was created to be by God, this is what he had to do. And I got to believe he also knew he wasn't going to have to do it by himself. That over the course of listening and praying, he was assured by God that God would be with him. This was all sort of brought home rather clearly to me yesterday. And part of this is a little confession time. Yesterday, Saturday's my day off. It's been kind of a busy week. I really just wanted to kind of rest, do some stuff around the house, that big long list that's piling up. But there was this Capona event, Central Pennsylvania Open and Affirming. Some of the members of our congregation put together. Tina Bowers-Powers, Shirley Keith Knox, Chris Hell, and a number of folks from St. Paul's attended. But I wasn't in charge. I didn't really have to be there. Joanne Carroll was the featured speaker. I've gotten to hear her before. She's wonderful. I was really tempted not to go. But I went. And this is what happened. Joanne Carroll spoke, and she was her normal, dynamic self. And then they had a panel come to speak. And the panel there were 10 transgender women and men who came to share their stories. And they were incredibly powerful stories. The struggles that they had been through. To a person. And there was an age range there. Young folk, trans men in their 20s to trans women in their 70s, 60s, 50s. To a person on that panel, they all said, early in my life, I recognized who I was. I recognized that my identity, my gender identity, did not match my physical body. I knew that. I knew that. And when I tried to communicate that or talk to other people about that, I was made fun of, I was bullied, I was hurt, I was told that that just can't be. And so, particularly for the older folks on the panel, they had to live their lives in ways that wasn't true to who they were. And they went to great lengths to try to hide who they were. But there came a point in each of their lives in which they said, I have to be authentic to how I was created. And they chose that. They didn't choose to be transgender. They chose to live their life authentically, how they were created by God. And in doing that, they found joy. It wasn't easy. They recognized the risks. Every one of those older transgendered folks lost a job. Every one. Many of them became disconnected with their family because their families didn't want anything to do with them. Many of them lost friends. Some of them, their spouse, they ended up having to get divorced. They knew the risk of what it meant for them to live authentically, but they couldn't pretend anymore. They couldn't hide it anymore. They couldn't live unauthentically in a way different than God created them. And they shared these stories so powerfully, and you could see the pain, and you could see the struggle, but you could also see the joy of what it was like for each of them when they finally were able to be who they were created to be. And even though many of them struggled with faith in God because of what they were told God thought of them, they maintained this kernel of faith. And as they became more of their authentic selves, they recognized that God had been with them the entire time and had sought to support them the entire time. Because that's how God works. One of the most discouraging moments was the story that was shared by a mother about her daughter. Her daughter's 9 now. At age 3, 4, 5, something in that range, young age, her daughter said, I'm not a boy. I know my body says that, but I'm not. I'm a girl. And her parents didn't know what to do, how they were going to deal with this. Fortunately, today, there are resources. Parents can go and find out information, and they did that. And this mother and their family came to support their daughter. They were willing to support her in her understanding of who she truly was. And so this mother went to the minister of her church. The family had been active. She herself had been very active in this congregation, and went to the pastor to say that, this is what her daughter said. We're going to support her. And her pastor said, if you allow your daughter to do this, she's going to hell. And if you support her, you're going to hell too. See what happens here? There are all sorts of expectations that the world places on us. There are all these things that were said that we're supposed to be and we're supposed to do. And it gets reinforced by all these people, the wider culture around us. And it also gets reinforced by the church. And the church is willing to say on occasion, in this case, don't be who you were created to be. That's somehow wrong. You will be punished if you do. This is why we need to participate authentically in Lent. This is why we need to spend 5 minutes or more talking to God and listening to God. Because God needs us to be who we were authentically created to be. And God needs us to act in the ways that God has created us to act. Because we need to be more active in working to protect people when they're told they're not loved by God. 40% of the trans community attempts suicide. 40%. That's almost half of the entire trans community attempts suicide. Most often it happens when folks are teenagers. That's just unacceptable. No one should be made to feel that badly about themselves that their only choice is to kill themselves. Members of the trans community live at or below the poverty line at a much higher rate than the rest of the population. Somewhere between double and triple. Trans people of color, 4 to 5 times more. There's something just totally wrong with that. That shouldn't happen. It's unacceptable. And there are churches, pastors, ministers who continue to condemn people for who they are. And that's unacceptable. But it doesn't become clear how unacceptable that is unless people start to say that out loud. And not only people in the trans community, but other folks. We have to say out loud, it's not acceptable that 40% of a population feels it needs to kill itself. And we're going to have to we're going to have to do something to make sure that people feel more accepted and more loved. It's unacceptable that that percentage of people in the trans community can't get good and decent jobs. And in the state of Pennsylvania, you can still be fired just because you're transgender. Or if you're gay or lesbian, you can still be fired. No one's willing to make a law to prevent that. That's wrong. And in many, many communities of faith, it's still not a safe place for people to belong, to be accepted if you're trans. We have to stand up and say, no more. This can't go on. We have to stand up and say publicly, out loud, this is a safe place. We stand with you. We need to do this now more than ever. Because the rhetoric that's coming out of Washington, out of the White House, has upped the ante on hate crimes. We don't even have to work very hard. The percentage of trans people that have been murdered so far this year is already up. It will only get worse. And we see it. Hate has been given permission to act out. Jewish cemeteries, the headstones are turned over. There's bomb threats to Jewish community centers. Mosques are attacked. If we, as people of faith, who believe that God calls us to be people who reach out and love other people exactly who they are, if we don't stand up and say enough, there will be silence. During Lent, if we speak and listen for what God is saying, we'll hear that. We will hear what God is asking us to do. We will be reminded of who we were created to be. God will remind us of that. And God will say, this is what I need you to do. And we will worry about what it will be like for us and what the consequences will be. And we will be afraid, and that's okay. Because God will also remind us that we're not alone. That we don't have to do this by ourselves. That we have a community of faith who will support us. And we have a God who will support us. You can give up chocolate if you want. But there's way more important stuff for us to be doing. Let's get to that. Amen.